Hi there. You're watching the second video in my series on AI literacy for college students. In this series of videos, I present information about artificially intelligent text generators to help students learn how these tools work, what their limitations are, and how we could use them effectively and ethically to help us research and write. In my first video, I explained the basics of how AI text generators write. I explained how they are trained using large collections of human writing, which we call the training data. And from that training data, these programs gather statistical information about how words tend to combine together. I also highlighted a limitation of this statistical pattern finding approach. I showed how text generators are prone to making up facts or sources. You're watching the second video in my series titled Artificial Intelligence and Artificial Ideologies. In this video, I'm going to discuss how AI technologies have ideological biases that they've picked up from observing humans. In this video, I'll provide an example of how these ideologies appear in the texts written by AI. I will also discuss how this can be a problem for students who want to use AI text generators for their writing and research. In my third video, I will demonstrate how I used AI text generators to help me write a literature review similar to one that I assigned to my students. I will provide advice for how students could use these tools effectively and ethically to help them research and write. My name is Nick Subterellu. I teach college-level writing, and I'm a scholar interested in how language works and what it says about our society. These videos draw on my experience as a scholar and as a writing teacher. As I explained in my first video, text generators like ChatGPT are designed to mimic human writing. They do this by processing a huge amount of written text and extracting statistical information about how humans write. Or more precisely, the program captures statistical information about how a particular group of humans write. The program observes only the group of people who wrote the texts that make up the program's training data. And this leads us into what I would like to cover in this video. Specifically, I will explain how text generators reflect ideological assumptions or biases that they pick up from their training data. The worldview or ideology that text generators have adopted from their training data can be problematic for us in a couple of ways. First, you might find that text generators echo ideologies that you personally oppose. In that case, you wouldn't want to use a text generator that is going to represent you in ways that you find offensive or problematic. Second, you might find that text generators echo assumptions about the world that perhaps you agree with. However, your professors may want you to challenge and critique these very same assumptions because it is directly relevant to what you're supposed to be learning in their class. For example, imagine you are taking a women's studies class, a gender studies class, or a sociology of gender class. In classes like these, your professor would want you to learn to recognize and discuss society's ideas about gender and ultimately to critique them. In that situation, it could be problematic to rely on a tool that tends to reflect society's biases back to us. Alice Shong is the global head of AI ethics at Sony. In a recent article, she compared artificial intelligence to a mirror. She writes, AI, like a mirror, tends to reflect the biased patterns present in its training data. In this video, I'm going to illustrate how text generators reflect these biased patterns back to us in the writing that they produce. More specifically, I'm going to show how OpenAI's ChatGPT reflects a dominant gender ideology related to women and the expectations society has for them. Before I get into my example, I want to take a moment to explain what I mean when I say gender ideology. If you're watching this video, I'm quite certain you live in a society with ideologies about gender. You yourself almost certainly have a gender ideology, and I certainly also have a gender ideology. When I talk about gender ideologies, I'm thinking about beliefs about the nature and meaning of gender. And there are a variety of different beliefs that are relevant to gender ideologies. Our answers to certain questions can help reveal what our gender ideologies are. For example, what gender categories should be recognized? Or what kind of roles should people who belong to each of these categories have in our society? We can describe a set of ideologies that are dominant or traditional in our society, including the one I live in, the United States. Here, dominant gender ideologies include things like there are two and only two genders, male and female. People's genders are a permanent and enduring feature of their identities. Men should be in charge of society's business, while women should care for the children and the home. And so on. I personally don't agree with these dominant gender ideologies, but I recognize them as ideas that have a powerful influence on how our society works. Rarely do we actually state these positions so plainly. In some cases, our ideologies might be explicit, like the direct statements I have presented here. However, often we aren't very conscious of our ideologies. They reflect elements of our social experience and cultural background that we're not fully aware of, and yet they show up in subtle ways. People are often more aware of ideologies when they are harmed by them. Thus, women and queer people usually have more awareness of dominant gender ideology than straight cis men like me. In the rest of this video, I will demonstrate how text generators write in ways that reflect gender ideologies they've learned from their training data. My example comes from research I did in the past, looking at how our society writes about women, and more specifically, the words it tends to use to describe women. I did this research using a large collection of texts similar to the training data used to create ChatGPT or other text generators. You can learn more about my methods in the articles I wrote about this research. I have included links to these articles in the video notes. In my research, I explored how words related to leadership and authority were used in gendered ways. In other words, the way these writers used these words revealed a pattern of bias against women. These words include bossy, pushy, shrill, screeching, and shrieking. In a few different articles, I wrote about how all of these words are more likely to be used to describe women than men. I've summarized some of the results of this research here on the screen. I found that the words pushy, shrill, shrieking, and screeching were much more likely to be used to describe women than men. As a result, there's a statistical association between women and words like pushy, shrill, screeching, and shrieking. For example, women are 3.14 times more likely to be described as shrieking than men. Therefore, the collection of texts I analyzed in my research contains subtle clues about the gender ideologies of the society that produced this writing. What does my research have to do with artificially intelligent text generators? The research I've discussed so far used large collections of text that are smaller but still comparable to the training data used for popular text generators. I think, based on this information, it's safe to assume that ChatGPT, Google Gemini, and other such text generators have been trained using data that reflects similar gender ideologies. The result is that AI text generators may demonstrate the same biases against women that I observed in my research. To demonstrate, I experimented with ChatGPT, exploring what would happen if I asked ChatGPT to tell me a story about a bossy person. I logged on and I wrote the following: tell me a story about a person being bossy. ChatGPT wrote a long story about a woman named Clara, who was a manager at a bakery. Here's the first paragraph of what it wrote. Once upon a time in the bustling town of Greendale, there was a woman named Clara who had a knack for taking charge. Clara was the manager of a popular bakery, Sweet Delights, known for its delicious pastries and warm, inviting atmosphere. However, Clara's leadership style was anything but sweet. It's important to remember that I did not specify the gender of the person in my prompt. ChatGPT made the assumption that a person who is bossy is probably a woman. When I tried the same experiment with words like pushy and shrill, I got the same result. Once again, ChatGPT assumed the shrill or pushy person must be a woman. These patterns suggest that ChatGPT has learned gender ideology from its training data. As I showed in my earlier research, large collections of human writing demonstrate exactly this kind of bias against women. How about another example? I read an article by a scholar named Nicole Gross. In it, Gross reported that she did a similar experiment with ChatGPT. She asked ChatGPT, "What does an economics professor look like?" ChatGPT responded by describing a person that seems to be a man, including, most notably, a person who has a beard. This suggests that ChatGPT assumes that economics professors are men, an idea it probably picked up from its training data. Nicole Gross's experiment inspired me to ask ChatGPT to tell me a story about a bossy economics professor, to see what gender it would assign. So, I logged on to ChatGPT again, and I wrote, "Tell me a story about a bossy economics professor." ChatGPT launched into a story about a female economics professor with a reputation for being bossy. Here's the first paragraph. Professor Judith Thorne was known across campus as one of the toughest and most demanding professors in the economics department at Eastwood University. Her reputation for being bossy and uncompromising was well earned, and her students often approached her class with a mix of fear and respect. Interestingly, even though Gross's experiment showed that ChatGPT tends to assume that economics professors are likely to be men, when I added the word bossy, ChatGPT suddenly imagined a woman. These experiments demonstrate how ChatGPT has been influenced by gender ideology in its training data. I want to note that ChatGPT demonstrates these ideological biases while also demonstrating awareness of how these same gender biases work in society. For example, in another experiment, I asked ChatGPT a question about these same biases directly. I asked, "Who do you think is more bossy, women or men?" ChatGPT's response showed a clear awareness of the kinds of biases I've been discussing in this video. It wrote, "The perception of being bossy can be influenced by various social, cultural, and individual factors, making it difficult to generalize across genders. Research suggests that both men and women can exhibit bossy behavior, but they may be perceived and judged differently due to societal expectations and stereotypes. Thus, we can see that ChatGPT's training data likely includes writing that critically analyzes gender ideologies. In fact, it's possible that the articles I wrote about bossy are part of ChatGPT's training data. Thus, it's possible that an artificially intelligent text generator may produce writing that critiques dominant gender ideologies. But as I showed earlier, in other cases, it may reflect those same ideologies in a more implicit manner. Just like the humans that they've learned from, AI text generators show contradiction or hypocrisy in their ideological stances. Therefore, it's important that students remain vigilant and examine everything ChatGPT writes before using it for their own purposes. I hope to have shown you how biases or assumptions found in the training data show up in the writing produced by ChatGPT or other text generators. It's important that students understand this and exercise caution about anything they use that these tools have written, because these assumptions and biases may appear subtly, but potentially have a big impact on how your writing is judged. Earlier, I mentioned the example of a student taking a college course about gender, like a women's studies class. In a class like that, it would be likely that your professor would expect you to think critically about dominant gender ideology. Your professor, for example, would not want you to repeat the idea that women are more bossy than men. You would instead be expected to challenge that idea. Thus, if you used a text generator to help you with your research or writing in that class, you would need to be very careful to ensure that the AI text generator did not produce anything that reflects these dominant gender ideologies. It's important to note that in this video I've only discussed gender ideologies, but this is really only one type of ideology that may show up in the writing produced by text generators. Other ideologies could include those related to race, disability, social class, or language background. I encourage you to explore how ChatGPT or other AI text generators deal with these topics. If you want to learn more about ideological bias in artificial intelligence, a good place to start is the article by Alice Shung I quoted from earlier in this video. You can find a link to it in the notes for this video. In the next video in this series, I will walk viewers through the process I took to use artificially intelligent text generators to support me in writing a literature review. I will demonstrate how I used an AI text generator throughout the process, and also share my final essay as an example of what you can produce if you use these tools ethically and effectively to assist you in your writing and research. If you found this video helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel.